The June 12th, 2025 meeting of the Santa Monica Rent Control Board is called to order. Would the secretary please call the roll?
Yes. Commissioner Ambrose?
Here.
Commissioner Dudek is absent. Commissioner Leslie?
Yes.
Vice Chair Ivanov?
Here.
Chair Gonska?
Here. All right, everyone, please rise and join us in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, before we dig into the agenda, I just wanted to ask the board, do a little bit of agenda maintenance here. We wanted to move item 12C, which is a presentation from the Consumer Protection Division, to follow agenda item 10, so between 10 and 11. And if there's any objection is there any objection from the board about reordering the agenda? Okay.
I got a question.
Sure.
Is anyone here for any of the items for the public hearings?
I don't have any speaker slips, and we're going to do the exemption before that.
Okay.
So it would be after the item 10.
Okay.
For the rest is they're public hearings, but it's board business. That
Okay.
good? Cool. Okay. So we'll do that, then we'll proceed accordingly with 12C following item 10. Okay, moving on to agenda item 5. If commissioners have had the opportunity to review the minutes from the May 8th meeting, may I have a motion for their approval?
No.
It's not showing up here, but do you want to make a motion?
Yeah, I make a motion that we accept the minutes.
Second.
All right, can we have a roll call, please?
Yes. Commissioner Ambrose?
Yes.
Commissioner Leslie?
Yes.
Vice Chair Ivanov?
Yes.
Chair Gonska?
Abstain. Okay, item 6, special agenda items. May we have a report from the executive director, please?
Yes, thank you, Chair, and good evening to you, Vice Chair and Commissioners. On May 22nd, staff held two well-attended seminars for both landlords and tenants. Topics included an overview of the rent control law, maximum level rent and general adjustment, registration fees, and owner occupancy exemptions. I want to thank our Public Information Manager, Dan Costello, for leading these events, along with Information Analyst Karen Evans and Information Coordinators Stephen Nice and Dennis Aruye. Recordings of the seminars are available on our website under Seminars and Newsletters. Registration fee invoices will be sent out at the end of this month. This evening, the board will decide whether to increase the per unit registration fee. Regardless of the outcome, all balances will be due in full by August 1st. If the fee is paid on time, landlords may pass through 50% of the per unit cost to each tenant. However, late payment disqualifies the landlord from passing through any portion of the 2025 fee. In addition, the general adjustment may not be applied until the total balance is paid in full. I strongly encourage landlords to watch for their invoice and pay promptly to avoid penalties. Once invoices are issued, payments can be made online through a Civics account or via one-time payment at rentcontrol.santamonica.gov. Landlords should also expect a mailing from the board that includes information on the 2025 general adjustment, a report on the maximum allowable rent for each of their properties, a notice of change in terms of tenancy to implement the September 1st rent increase, and the required rent control information sheet for new tenants. Landlords should be aware that failure to provide the information sheet at the start of a tenancy will bar the landlord from increasing the rent until that requirement is met. Our summer newsletter will be arriving in tenant mailboxes soon with information about the general adjustment and how to interpret a rent increase notice. The newsletter will also include the maximum allowable rent for that tenant's unit. Tenants or landlords with questions about these mailings are encouraged to contact us at 310-458-8751 or email rentcontrol@santamonica.gov. I'm also pleased to share that our public information staff will have a table at the Santa Monica Pride event on June 21st. Please stop by to learn more about rent control or just to say hello. I know the board has expressed interest in the status of the city's effort to establish a registry for non-controlled rental units. That project is now being led by the Housing and Human Services Department. Rent control staff participates in an interdepartmental working group along with IT, finance, city attorney's office, and community development. Based on HHS's presentation to the City Council on May 27th, I anticipate that they will return to Council with an implementation plan by no later than October. That concludes my comments. I'd like to now turn it over to our General Counsel for a brief report.
Thank you, Chair. Good evening, Commissioners. I was asked to provide an update on 220 San Vicente, the ongoing renovation project there. We are continuing with our bi-weekly meetings to get updates from the manager of that project, and we just had one last Tuesday, and she was able to update us that the first floor has been completed and those tenants are back in their units. They are now doing the second floor. The asbestos has been abated and they are now proceeding with installing the sprinkler. The manager anticipates that those tenants will come back into their units by mid-July, perhaps even a little bit sooner. She also informed us that the rest of the floors, the rest of the work on floors 4 through the penthouse are going to be on hold while the owners determine how best to move forward given some financial constraints that they are dealing with. So we are going to continue to meet bi-weekly with the manager until the tenants that are currently relocated are back into their units, just to make sure that everything there is still proceeding smoothly. But then the manager is going to update us when they have submitted some additional plans to the fire department. We're going to review those, and then she will let us know when they're able to resume the project. She has assured us that when they continue the project, the tenants on the next floor to be relocated will be given at least 30 days notice, so that will still continue. And so I imagine I won't have another update for you until the project resumes, but when it does, I'll come back before the board and let you know how it's progressing. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. It's obviously very good to hear that they're going to be giving the 30-day notice, which I believe would be required. But if not, regardless, it's good that they're doing that 30-day notice before they move on to the next floor. Hopefully, we can encourage them to also just keep tenants informed as they have information, because sometimes it's, even if it means disturbing their lives and having to move out, it's helpful to have some certainty. And so if this is just sort of hanging out there and people don't have any idea when they're going to potentially have to move out, people may have things planned later in the summer that now this shifts their timeline, it shifts their plans. So hopefully the management can keep them updated very frequently, even if it's more often than the 30 days.
Yeah, we agree. We've been encouraging Tatina to continue their communications, and she's been very good about updating the tenants on the current status of the project, but we'll make sure she continues to do that. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I don't currently have any slips, but do we have any public speakers? Okay. Just as a reminder that we give during all meetings ahead of public comment, just a reminder that the public's welcome to discuss anything that's within the board's subject matter jurisdiction, but please remember that the board can't take any action or really have any discussion on anything that's presented here unless it's on tonight's agenda. So we have one public speaker, Zoe Montaner. You can approach the podium. And when you're ready, you'll have 3 minutes.
Good evening, esteemed rent control board members. As you know, the issue with my building, 643 Pacific Street, Sean Besser presented himself with Janine Morris as the landlords when they were actually renting the building from a property owner, Jaime Suarez, of the Suarez team. And they've been stealing money from the city since April of 2019. Obviously, Sean Besser is the president of the Ocean Park Association, incredible political connections. Former Mayor Glenn Davis was at the OPA meeting on Monday, and they were having a love fest there. However, the lawyer of the owner facilitated me with the notice of violations from code enforcement. It is obscene what goes on in this city. And it doesn't surprise me that we are broke. Not me, the city. Because the constant exposure to litigation is preventable. You just have to do your job. You just have to stop protecting your friends and protecting the people with political connections, because lawsuits come and stop the cover-up. Because you continue to cover up for your friends and the people that contribute to your political campaigns, and here we are. I'm going to put this, please, on the record so you have the facts to do an investigation and do what is right to charge Sean Besser and Janine Morris, Santa Monica Beach co-living, who actually sent me a text when I discovered this, that they said, and I quote, "We work closely with Santa Monica Rent Control." Those were their words, not mine. The lawyer also sent a 7-day warning letter to perform covenants and conditions or quit to Sean Besser and Janine Morris. They copy me. But the owner is pretending that he didn't know what was happening when I actually emailed him 10 months ago. So now he's doing this political theater and legal theater maneuver to pretend that he didn't know anything when I actually gave evidence to your office that 10 months ago that he knows this was taking place. So here are the rent control news that you sent me with the actual price. He was charging 3 times over the MAR. That's the scam. Since April of 2019. Do the math.
Thank you. I have one quick question. Okay, thank you. Okay. You're good now? Okay. Yeah, I was looking at the screen. I couldn't tell. Okay, so that concludes our public comment, and now we'll move on to item 10, jurisdictional items, and 10A1, which is a request for an owner occupancy exemption for the property at 2610 Highland Avenue. May we have a staff report, please?
Good evening, Commissioners. This is an exemption application by Allison Marks for this property at 2610 Highland. It's a 3-unit property. She states that she moved on to the property back in September of 2023, and she's applied for its exemption. She is the sole owner of the property. The property only has 3 units. So the only remaining question is whether she's provided sufficient evidence to show that she's lived on the property for at least 120 days before she filed the application, or if she's lived there at least since November 14th of 2024. And Ms. Marks doesn't own any other residential property. She provided utility, financial, and government records that show that she uses this property as her mailing address, There are tenants on the property. The tenants were contacted, a staff report was sent to them. I followed up with them, and they confirmed that she does in fact live on the property. And because she has provided evidence that shows that she meets the criteria for the exemption, staff recommends that you grant the exemption application and adopt the attached findings of fact and conclusions of law.
Okay, thank you. Do any commissioners have any questions about the staff report before we begin deliberations? No? Okay. Is the applicant or their representative present and wishing to address the board? I don't believe so.
They're not.
Okay. All right, so we can move to deliberations or take a motion. Commissioner Ivanov or Vice Chair Ivanov?
All the requirements are met here, so I would move that we adopt the findings of facts and conclusions of law.
Second.
Okay, we have a motion from Vice Chair Ivanov and a second from Commissioner Ambrose. May we have a roll call vote, please?
Yes. Commissioner Ambrose,
Yes.
Commissioner Leslie,
Yes.
Vice Chair Ivanov,
Yes.
Chair Gonska.
Yes.
Motion carries.
Okay, moving along to item 12C. We'll now hear a presentation from the Consumer Protection Division of the City Attorney's Office concerning the City Council's consideration of a proposed ordinance banning the sale and use of algorithmic tools for setting residential rents. So now we'll welcome the City Chief Deputy City Attorney.
Thank you. Good evening. Sorry. Gonna help me pull up the presentation here. Thank you. Thank you for having me. My name's Romy Ganch. I'm the Chief Deputy City Attorney for the Consumer Protection Unit in the City Attorney's Office, and I'm happy to be here tonight to explain, talk a little bit about this ordinance that Council is now considering. So, Council is considering an ordinance that is directed at algorithmic rental pricing software. It kind of goes by a few different names. It's a mouthful. I think those 4 words kind of sum it up the best in that order, but you'll see these words in a different order sometimes. But what is algorithmic rental pricing software? It's a software program that uses data about rent and occupancy levels that are occurring in the market, and that could be defined small or large, to recommend to landlords what rent and occupancy levels they can achieve for their own apartments or their own buildings, their properties. Now, sometimes this can be seen as not necessarily anti-competitive, not necessarily causing distortions in the rental housing market that are to the detriment of consumers, but certainly anti-competitive or problematic applications of this kind of software use non-public data that are submitted by landlords, non-public data such as what the landlord is actually charging for their rental units and how many units they actually have available for rent, as opposed to information they're putting out generally on rental listing websites. So using that non-public data to make recommendations to other landlords that are competing in the same market what rents they should be charging for their units based on what the algorithm knows that other landlords in the same market are charging. So there are these software programs out there that do this now, and they've gotten a lot of attention recently. Part of the 2 main identified problems with these software programs are that they can lead to higher rents and more displacement, which is obviously a problem for consumers. So a study from the White House Council of Economic Advisors found that for landlords that use these rental pricing algorithms, it can cost tenants on average nationally $70 per month extra in rent, more than they would have paid if their landlord didn't use that. The numbers are a little lower in the LA metro area, but it's still an extra $408 per year that tenants is sort of attributed to the fact of using the software. And the White House study also found that even landlords that don't use the software are likely to see their rents increase as well, because they're going to have lower priced units than the landlords that are using the software. There's going to be more demand for their lower price units, which is going to drive up the cost of their own units as well. So it has an overall distorting effect on the market, driving rents up. The other thing about these softwares is that they prize revenue, increased revenue over all else. So the sort of conventional wisdom, I guess, for landlords has been generally that it's, turnover is costly. And it's often beneficial to keep rents slightly lower if necessary to avoid having to deal with turnover and flipping over units. these algorithms have, in some cases, demonstrated that actually if you charge really high rents and you force turnover, you can actually increase revenue if you're willing to do that. And a lot of times landlords aren't necessarily interested or willing to do that if it on their own accord, but when a software program is recommending that they do that and they follow those recommendations, it leads to greater displacement. So this is actually from a 2008 study, because this software has been around for a while, where one landlord reported a 15% higher turnover rate after using the software, and citing this sort of the heads above beds above all else, which used to be sort of the conventional wisdom, is not necessarily the best strategy if what you want to do is maximize revenue, as opposed to maybe serve the community and house as many people as you can. So these are sort of the two major problems with these softwares that people want to try to address. So I mentioned this has been around for a while, but in October 2022, ProPublica did a story really highlighting the biggest player in the field called RealPage, and at the time their signature product was called YieldStar. They have a couple products now, but they issued this 2022 report that got a lot of attention. It had some very unflattering language from some of the landlords and the developers of the software who were using it, who were sort of gloating about how great the software is and it gives us so much money, and it's just amazing how this software teaches us to overcome our own empathetic impulses to be nicer to our tenants, and there's just way too much empathy when landlords are setting these prices personally. So this kind of made a big splash because it did not really reflect that well upon the community, but they also laid bare pretty much how they were using private data, and this was sort of the new innovation, non-public data to generate these recommendations. And they basically acknowledged in this reporting that landlords working together, colluding, to set prices together was to the benefit to all landlords. So that really caught the attention of a lot of regulators who were sort of already in on this, but it brought a lot of attention to consumers as well. And so in the last few years, there have been over 35 class action lawsuits filed just against RealPage. There's another competitor, Yardi Systems, which has a similar product that's also gotten some litigation. States attorney generals have filed suit in state court. And then last year, the biggest sort of event of all of this, the U.S. Department of Justice and 8 state attorney generals, including the California Attorney General, sued RealPage in federal court. And just this January, they added to their lawsuit 6 of the largest management companies that operate multifamily properties throughout the country. They added them to the lawsuit and alleged that they're also involved in this anti-competitive price-fixing behavior in violation of antitrust laws. So even though that litigation is helpful, it's drawing attention to the issue, there's still room for regulation, certainly on the local level. So in July 2024, San Francisco became the first city in the country to ban the sale and use of the software. A bunch of other cities have followed suit, including in California. And the city council here has directed that the city of Santa Monica draft something similar. So we've done that. We proposed something to the city council, and it'll be coming forward for a second reading soon. But we also want to share with you all and hear your thoughts on it. So the drafted ordinance that will be coming back to City Council for a second reading at their next meeting, basically it's pretty simple and straightforward, and it's very similar to the ordinances we see in other places, including San Francisco, but it bans the sale and the use of an algorithmic device. And an algorithmic device, there's sort of the long definition here, but it's basically a software product that incorporates algorithms and uses non-public competitor data to make recommendations about how much rent to charge and whether or not to leave a unit vacant in order to maximize revenue. So this definition doesn't include software programs that use only aggregated data that isn't individualized. Like a lot of times there's sort of trade publications that just are reporting on what's going on in the market. And we don't want to, interfere with that sort of research and sort of reporting First Amendment activity, just reporting on what's going on in the market. And this definition also doesn't cover, obviously, it's not really an algorithm, but the procedures and the formulas that we use at the city to set rents and rents and income levels for our affordable housing program. And these are common exclusions from the other ordinances as well. The other thing that the city council here wanted to make sure we did was that we included good remedies in our ordinance. And so the remedies that we've drafted look very similar to the remedies that we have under our tenant harassment ordinance, our relocation ordinance. They're very similar, which entitle an aggrieved person, so that could be a tenant or a consumer who is renting or trying to rent a unit that was unlawfully using this software, or the city, and that would be our department. The city attorney's office could also bring a civil action. We could seek an injunction against a landlord or a software purveyor who's unlawfully selling the software in the jurisdiction. And we could also seek actual damages or civil penalties. In the case of the city, it'd be more likely to be civil penalties of up to $1,000 per violation. So, and the ordinance also specifies that every month that a tenant is charged a rent that was unlawfully set with one of these algorithms would be a separate violation. So that could be $1,000 every month that they're charged one of these unlawful rent amounts. The ordinance also allows for a prevailing party to recover attorney's fees, which is really critical to enabling the private bar to take these cases, but also to for our office to be able to recover our own costs as well when we bring these cases. The other thing the ordinance does or would do is provide an affirmative defense to a tenant in an eviction case. So if a tenant can establish that if a tenant's being sued for non-payment of rent, and the tenant establishes, well, my rent was set unlawfully after this ordinance was passed by one of these algorithms, that could be a defense to an eviction. That doesn't necessarily mean in these eviction cases, that doesn't necessarily mean they don't owe the rent. They might have another claim for not having to pay the rent if they brought their own affirmative case, but it could at least forestall the eviction. So as I mentioned, the second reading will be at the next meeting, June 24th. If it's adopted, it'll become effective 30 days after that. We will then, do a campaign to make sure that landlords are aware of this new requirement. We also want to make sure that tenants are aware of it too. And then we'll go forward and review our compliance. But I'm eager to hear tonight if you all have any questions, recommendations, or suggestions for our further work with the Rent Control Agency on how we can effectuate this.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
Really appreciate that. Do any commissioners want to join the queue with questions? Vice Chair Ivanov?
Yes, I just have a few questions. And thanks again for that was a great presentation. You mentioned several jurisdictions that have already implemented something of this nature.
Mm-hmm.
I'm assuming you've looked at the ordinances that are passed there and
Right.
what works, what doesn't work in drafting this ordinance.
That's right.
You mentioned San Francisco in particular. I think you mentioned that they implemented it in July of 2024.
They passed it, yeah.
We're only about almost a year from that point, but is there any data yet at all about average rents in San Francisco since the passage of this ordinance?
Question. I don't know. We could certainly try to contact them to find that out. It was sort of hard to find even the White House Council on Economic Advisors report that there was. That's kind of the only clear study about this out there. But we can certainly, connect with that office to see if they have more information.
Okay. And there's also, there's Senate Bill 52, the state version.
Mm-hmm.
Are you looking at that as well, just to make sure that there's no conflict between, the city and state legislation?
Yeah, I mean, we'll make sure that to the extent it's not preempted, it's something we can continue to enforce. There's also, there's been discussion about this preemption or prohibition on states and local jurisdictions passing or enforcing these sorts of ordinances in the congressional budget bill. But, then nothing's been passed yet, so we'll just monitor those things and adjust accordingly.
Great, thank you.
Okay, Commissioner Ambrose.
Hi, and thank you for your presentation as well. I guess going back to San Francisco, since that was the first city in the country, do we have any information about how there has been enforcement or what their penalties are? And
They have similar penalties of, I believe that similarly their city attorney's office can bring enforcement actions, and they also have the $1,000 violation penalty. That's kind of standard across these ordinances. I don't know, if they have filed a case, it's not been publicized that I was able to find. A lot of these ordinances, many jurisdictions have these ordinances or things like these tenant protection ordinances, and there's not a lot of public resources committed to enforcing them. So we're a little set apart in that respect. So I don't know if there's been an enforcement action brought.
right, yeah, and that's my concern. How do we practically enforce companies online from selling these services to landlords? How do we enforce the companies on one end and then penalize the landlords from using the software? It seems quite difficult, and it also seems like it places the burden on the tenant to understand whether or not they're being the victim of the software. Is that
I mean,
correct?
I will say that, you know, generally the software's not cheap. And so, and it sort of operates on a volume basis. And so typically the landlords that are going to be using this are going to be ones with larger portfolios. That may not include a lot of rent-controlled landlords, or a lot of rent-controlled landlords might not have reason to use this sort of software. Also, since they can only reset rents at vacancy anyway. For some of the non-regulated units where they're more readily turning things over and they have a much larger portfolio, those landlords are more likely to be using the software. There's also, as I mentioned, RealPage is certainly the biggest player of this out there. They're sort of the target of it. There's a couple of one or two other software programs out there, but it's not as if they're sort of cropping up all over the place. But I do think a thoughtful education campaign around the landlords that are certainly most likely to be using it is the best approach. There's a further complication, of course, which is also just like understanding what the technology in the software does. It's kind of gobbledygook, like, you know, there's a lot of questions about what exactly these algorithms are doing. So demonstrating, improving exactly what they're doing is another level of a complication. A lot of the public information about what RealPage has done, there's some debate publicly about what exactly their software does right now.
And I understand wanting to follow the model of San Francisco having the penalty of $1,000, but like you were saying that it's the larger companies that are setting these inflated prices, and it would seem that their benefit would be more than $1,000, at least for multiple units. Then the penalty of $1,000 seems almost minuscule.
Right. I mean, so it would be a $1,000 penalty per month and per unit that they do this for. So if you have a 200-unit building, and we have those sorts of properties here in Santa Monica, you know, $1,000 is somewhat commensurate to sort of it's certainly higher than we think probably the algorithm would be distorting the market. So we want there to be somewhat of a relationship between what the algorithm is doing to driving up rents, you know, a ratio that makes some sense.
Right.
But I appreciate that.
Yeah. Thank you.
Commissioner Leslie?
I have a couple questions. So is there a way to detect this using IT department?
That's a good question. I mean, I think the question, one way to think about that is there a way to really clearly evaluate what some of these programs, and perhaps the ones that are not the name brand ones, exactly what they're doing and what how the algorithms work, if they're falling within the definition of our ordinance? That's a great question. It's something we can certainly look at, because I think that will be a little bit of a challenge, is figuring exactly what these algorithms are doing.
And also with the detection of these algorithms, what would it cost to, or how many staff members would you need to detect the algorithms as far as an increase in staff?
I mean, we'd probably have to do some proactive outreach and enforcement to identify which landlords we think are likely to be using this type of a software, and do some proactive outreach to determine whether they are. We'd have to, you know, we'd have to have a reason to think that they're using the software in order to, you know, go in and evaluate what their software does. It's not, I don't want to suggest that we can do like a survey of all the software that every landlord in Santa Monica is using. So I think as I mentioned, we would be most likely to, at the beginning at least, go after those landlords that are known to be using these softwares because they're named in the Department of Justice lawsuit. 3 of those landlords do operate in Santa Monica. We know those landlords use the RealPage program, but there are likely landlords of similar size and developers or management companies of similar size that are likely to be using this or another software. So we'd probably target those first.
And let me,
The resources, that's hard to say. We have the resources that we have in our office, and this is a part of our tenant protection program. So we would dedicate as many resources as we can. I don't know that I can give you an answer on how many people it would take to fully audit all of those.
so let me tell you where I'm going to.
Yeah.
And it's my hope that maybe they could be detected while some of our code enforcement officers, we could switch some people into detecting this through IT, so they wouldn't have to necessarily go out in the field to detect this, and you get more of the algorithms detected without having to actually go out.
Yeah, I think one of the tricks is that these are algorithms that are going to be sort of maintained and used privately on the private computers and servers of the landlord. So we can't just go out and require every landlord to give us access to their computers. We'll have to have some basis for an investigation. And so there'll have to be, some reason to think that a landlord's doing this, and
Just a high-tech way of trying to detect it,
Yeah.
that's all.
the more we can do that way, the best.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, and perhaps, I think with a lot of things that we do when it comes to rent, and certainly this, the enforcement's always a challenge. And I think, often though, what large landlords that operate in Santa Monica likely operate in other jurisdictions as well. So if, hopefully we'll be monitoring enforcements that are happening in other jurisdictions to the extent that that's possible, because if a landlord who operates here is violating ordinances similar to this in other places, then that they're probably violating it here too.
Right.
So it's at least an indicator where you might have reason to do further investigation on that.
Right. That's a great idea.
The only question I have, and thank you very much for being here tonight. I know this is something that we've discussed at length at previous board meetings, and something that's obviously of great concern to us. So we're happy that the city council is taking it up and that you're here presenting. The only other question I have was, obviously, there's been a change in the administration in the White House. You mentioned, if you haven't been paying attention, but you mentioned that in January, I think before the administration changed, there's a federal suit. Is there any? You mentioned also that the congressional budget bill might address this, but is there anything coming out of the administration in particular to that lawsuit since the Trump administration came in?
The last I checked on the lawsuit, they were sort of briefing whether some party should be in the lawsuit, and it was still moving forward. The other thing that happened in January, in addition to naming these individual landlords, is that the state attorneys general added claims under state law. So our attorney general added claims against all these landlords under our unfair business practices law. So even if the U.S. Department of Justice were to get out of it, we would have our own claims to pursue through our attorney general. It probably wasn't coincidental that they chose to do that in January, knowing there was going to be a change in the administration.
Okay, great. Any other questions or comments? Okay, thank you again for being here tonight. We really appreciate it.
We're happy to continue to work with the Rent Control Agency on figuring out how we can do education around this, reach out to landlords and tenants, make sure that they know, and we can receive complaints as well.
Excellent, thank you.
Thank you.
And before we move on to the next agenda item, we do have a public speaker who'd like to speak to this item. Zoe Montanero, if you'd want to come up to the podium here. Yes. Yeah, and when you're ready to begin, you'll have 3 minutes.
Good evening again. I just want to clarify something. Years ago in 2014, when I ran for city council the first time, I came to this chamber to speak about rent control. There was an issue. And when I was downstairs with a member of this body that is no longer part of this body, she told me, we need to get you a job in City Hall. And I was struck because I never made my need of employment known to her. But when she used the word we, I understood that she was speaking for an organization that wants to place people in City Hall in different departments to know what is going on. And I know that some of you are in a tough position because you receive orders from outside and from inside, and it's difficult to do your job. So I just want to acknowledge that. Because you talk of the word colluding and the word enforcement, and the word part of the city attorney's office tenant protection program, I think is ironic that we are talking about an algorithm program that poses troubles for tenants when we have already other issues like the one with Sean Besser, where there are loopholes to raise the MAR. So I think it's dishonest to think that there's an interest in protecting tenants when the record in my particular case, not only of the property that I currently live in, but 1131 with Marty Kaplan, with 500 California Avenue with Pat Kramer, people that have connections to the city get away with all sorts of violation. So it's not difficult to enforce. I disagree. I respectfully disagree, Chair Gonska. It's not difficult to enforce. You just have to be intentional about enforcement. And when you're intentional and you do your job and you want to protect tenants, the job can be done. But if the city attorney's office does not want to enforce because she's receiving outside pressure from political organizations, then we have a problem of enforcement. You can look at me. Good evening. Thank you for letting me speak.
Thank you. All right, moving along to item 11, public hearings. 11A is regarding imposing a $60 ceiling on the 2025 general adjustment of 2.3%. May we have a staff report, please?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Along with the board's announcement of the annual general adjustment of the rent increase for 2025, the board is also going to decide whether or not to impose a dollar amount limit on that annual general adjustment. This is governed by a formula in the charter. It's laid out in the staff report. And based on that formula, the dollar amount this year would be $60 should the board choose to impose it. I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Okay, Vice Chair Ivanov?
My only question is, do we have any kind of data of how many within a certain period of time, whether it's 10 years, 20 years, of how many times the board has opted to implement the cap versus how many times it opted not to?
We do. I don't have that with me tonight, but I can tell you I don't recall a time when the board has not imposed the dollar amount limit.
Commissioner Ambrose? It's not a question. Oh, okay. That's okay. Any other questions? Okay. Are you going to move to make a motion, or you just want to comment? Okay, well, then we'll go to you next. Commissioner Ambrose?
Let's see. I just wanted to, is my microphone?
It's not.
Okay, there we go. I just wanted to say that for those units that would be capped at the $60, those are those that are at or close to the market rate. The presumption is that the landlord is already making a fair return, and I wanted to dispel the misconception that those who pay higher rent have more disposable income and can afford a higher proportional rent increase. And also that the calculation is already written into the charter for a reason, and that it's understood that rent control is supposed to provide certainty for people of all income levels. That during these difficult times, we have over 27,000 rent-controlled units that could benefit from the protections that are allowed by our rent-control charter. And I think that the $60 cap is fair for all of our rent-controlled units. So that's all.
Okay, thank
My
you.
comments.
Thank you. I apologize. I should have opened the public hearing before we moved to comments, so we'll just do that now. I don't have any speaker slips for this item. Are there any members of the public that would like to address the board in regards to this topic during the public hearing? Okay. Seeing none, we'll close the public hearing and move back to... Oh, I'm sorry. You can, yes, step up to the microphone here. I think, is it 3 minutes that we can?
I have a small 8-unit building. And in the last 4 years, I've spent over $400,000. So when you're saying fair and all this kind of stuff, not so.
Okay, thank you. Any other members of the public that would like to address the board? Okay, we'll close the public hearing then and move back to comment from commissioners. Do we have any other comments from other commissioners? Okay. Just a couple of things I'd like to point out. You know, looking through a lot of the data that we had, I think, was it presented to us in April, the annual report has an unbelievable amount of really helpful data, and in particular to this issue. And so I was looking back at what our staff report points out is that if we were to implement this $60 cap, it would apply to units with MARs of $2,587 and above. So I went back and looked in the annual report at sort of what the median MARs are now currently. And if you look at a one-bedroom, overall across all tenancy start dates in the city currently, that median is $2,295. For tenancies that began in 2024, it's $2,650. For two bedrooms currently across all start dates, it's $2,871. 2024 tenancy start dates is $3,600 median for two-bedroom apartments. And as you can imagine, for three-bedroom and larger, those rents are even higher. So my point with bringing those statistics up is that this would actually impact quite a few units across the city. And so sometimes there is a perception that capping, because of the relatively higher MARs that the cap is impacting, that it's only wealthy people who are paying higher rents for nicer units or bigger units that are being helped out with this. But the data shows us that a very substantial portion, because when we're talking about, you know, medians of $2,295 for a one-bedroom or $2,871 for a two-bedroom, that means that for two-bedroom apartments, at least half, but likely much more than half of those units are going to be impacted by a cap of $60. So this is, and also we've discussed many times in the past that there is no inherent correlation between the amount of rent that somebody's paying under rent control and the affordability of that unit or that person's income. And often some of the most rent burdened people in the city are people who have recently moved into a unit and are paying very high rent. And they're able to move into the city, but maybe they're stretching their budget as far as they can stretch it. We want to make sure that they aren't forced to leave after their first year when the rent goes up too high beyond what their means are. One other thing I just wanted to point out from this, I can't remember if it was the staff report or the annual report, but it was pointed out that roughly 2/3 of rent control tenants are at market rate and would be positively impacted by the $60 ceiling. So I'm in support of it for those reasons and other reasons. And just wanted to make sure to draw attention to those in particular. Commissioner Ambrose?
Yeah, thank you for providing those statistics. I think that, well, I think with my math, a person who pays $2,700 or above would be, or maybe even a little lower, would meet the cap. And so I'm thinking of people that have families, even students that are just, you know, struggling to get by, pulling rent with roommates. So, you know, the assumption that those who are paying higher rent have more disposable income is just not true. And furthermore, again, rent control is not a program for low-income people. It's in our charter for everyone. So for the same reasons, I also, again, would be prepared to move this motion.
One other, some other statistics that I forgot to mention I'd like to point out was looking at what is considered affordable. And we've talked about this many times, but according to the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, the standard is that a unit housing is affordable if a tenant is not spending more than 30% of their household income on the housing. So looking at those median rent prices that I mentioned at the different size apartments, looking at what income is required for those to be affordable here in Santa Monica. For a one-bedroom, required income would be $106,000. For a two-bedroom, $144,000. For a three-bedroom, $192,000. So you can imagine, I mean, you know, many different makeups of families and roommates. But if you're looking at a single parent with a couple of children that needs a 2 or 3 bedroom apartment and needs to make nearly $200,000 a year, there are a lot of people who are paying much more than 30% of their income, and it's definitely unaffordable. So this is one way that we can still give an increase to landlords, you know, but we can also limit it so that it doesn't become unaffordable for more current tenants. Any other questions or before we make a motion? Okay. Then I would move to adopt Resolution 25-001, announcing the 2.3% general adjustment for 2025 and imposing a $60 ceiling.
Second.
Okay. Maybe have a roll call vote, please.
Yes. Commissioner Ambrose,
Yes.
Commissioner Leslie,
Yes.
Vice Chair Ivanov,
Yes.
Chair Ganska.
Yes.
The motion carries.
Okay. Moving along to item 11B. The board will now hold a public hearing on the proposed operating budget for fiscal year 2025-2026. Will staff please present the report?
Yes, thank you, Chair. We have a presentation coming up on the screen in a second. There it is. Okay, so as you know, the board received a presentation on the fiscal year 25-26 proposed operating budget at its last regular meeting and set this for a public hearing for adoption tonight. Once again, I'm joined this evening by our budget coordinator, Lima Noseworthy, who is also going to be available for questions. Next slide, please. That's our organizational chart. There are no changes being made. Next slide, please. The fiscal context is as follows. Total expenditures for FY 25-26 are projected at $6,777,395. Estimated revenue for the same period is $6,524,030, resulting in a projected deficit of $253,365. This deficit is primarily due to one-time costs, including accrued leave payouts for anticipated retirements and significant office renovations. And we expect that we'll have a return to surplus in the next fiscal year. Next slide, please. The key budget drivers for the upcoming fiscal year, permanent employee line is $3,706,881, including the technical services analyst from the city's Information Services Department. Employee benefits are $952,416 for retirement contributions. That's roughly 25% of staff salaries, and $540,781 for health, dental, and vision premiums. And that reflects a 10% increase from the current fiscal year. As for administrative indirect costs, that's going to be projected at $452,682, which is a 5.01% increase over the current fiscal year. Capital outlay is $300,000 for office renovations to modernize workspaces and improve functionality. Next slide, please. The budget proposes a 12% increase to the annual registration fee. What did I say? Did I say 12%? I did it last time too. Not 12%, $12, sorry. Raising it from $228 to $240 per unit. The split cost for this increase is 50 cents per month per unit. With that increase, we expect to generate an additional $319,800 in revenue, and projected total revenue for fiscal year 25-26 is $6,524,030, which is primarily, as always, from registration fees. Next slide, please. The expense breakdown for the proposed budget is the total for salary and wages of $5,455,438. That includes permanent employees, as-needed staff, and overtime. Supplies and expenses are anticipated to be $960,108. That includes things like postage, printing, and our service agreements. Capital outlay in total is $361,850, including the building renovations I mentioned and IT systems. And our non-operating expense is the $54,318 for the 9th of 10 annual CalPERS loan paydown payments. Next slide, please. Here's a review of our reserve fund. The Rent Control Agency always aims to maintain a reserve fund of at least the recommended 12 to 15% of the current year's operating budget and an amount equal to the earned leave accruals for employees. Projected reserves at the start of the fiscal year 25-26 year are approximately 1.9 million with an end-of-year projection of approximately 1.6 million. These reserves provide a financial cushion for unexpected costs and help maintain fiscal stability. The proposed budget includes measures to rebuild reserves following significant one-time expenditures, ensuring long-term financial resilience. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, the proposed budget reflects the agency's ongoing commitment to fiscal responsibility and operational efficiency, and the $12 registration fee increase is modest and necessary to address one-time costs and maintain our long-term fiscal stability. I'd like to thank Lima again for her hard work on this budget, and we're available for any questions the board might have.
Thank you very much. Do we have any questions from commissioners? I know that we discussed, you guys were presented last meeting when I wasn't here, so I do have some questions, and I apologize for that, but I'll ask those. First, we'll go to Vice Chair Ivanov.
Yeah, so my one question was, you mentioned because we have a deficit, obviously, with this budget, which is going to eat away into the reserves a little bit. You mentioned that in this budget, there's built-in measures to sustain reserves after like these one-time major costs. Can you talk like any more specifics about those measures to make sure that we're not eating into our reserves too much in the coming years?
Sure. Well, the increasing the registration fee at this time will help. This year's, both the capital costs, particularly with the building renovations, and the retirement costs are substantial, and those won't be here next year. There'll be cost savings because obviously staff that replaces retirees usually comes in at a lower salary rate. And there's, so those are the main areas. I mean, salaries are obviously our most costly expenditure, and there can be some significant savings realized there. So the combination of raising it now and what we expect to be a lessening of salary costs, and also which that tracks with our CalPERS contributions, will bring, you know, the overall amount that we have to spend down, and we would expect then that there would be a surplus next year. For the following fiscal year, it's hard to say at this point. I mean, it's hard to go out that, you know, that far and know for certain what the landscape will look like. But nonetheless, if we can get a reserve increase during the next fiscal year, and you know, maybe a small deficit or a small surplus in the following year, then we're in good financial shape, and hopefully don't have to come back and ask for any increases in the registration fee maybe until year 4. So that's why we anticipate it'll be like that.
So without this one-time cost of the modernization, we would actually be in a surplus with all else being equal in this budget, right?
If we raise the registration fee.
Right.
Right, correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, Commissioner Ambrose?
And thanks for the report. I think it's great that we're able to do so much with only 24 full-time staff positions, considering that there's 27,000 rent-controlled units in our city. That's like, you know, less than 1 per 1,000 units. So that's wonderful. Can you just speak a little bit to how many employees are retiring this year and sort of what the staff changes will be like in the following months or a year and a half or so?
Everything at this point, without folks formally announcing, is
Okay.
unknown.
Okay,
These are, like everything in the budget, it's a projection and an anticipation based on what we know, and some things we just don't know for certain. So it's just a projection.
okay.
Yeah.
Well, we don't quite know yet.
Don't quite know yet.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Commissioner Leslie?
So I just had a quick question as far as with health insurance. Have you seen a rise with health insurance as well as we've seen for regular insurance, for renters insurance and property insurance as well?
We see it every year, usually. And the 10% increase projected by the city is based on past experience. So for them, it's a projection too, but they're usually pretty spot on with that, or close to it anyway.
If there is an increase of more than 10%, how will we remedy that?
If it's significant and we can't absorb it through other sources that we have already budgeted for, then, we might have to revisit it formally. But as far as I'm aware, maybe Lima has a different experience. I'm not aware of that having happened in any time in the recent history, but yeah, we've usually, the city, we get the information from the city and we've used that and it's been pretty good. But if it was a crisis situation and they skyrocketed unexpectedly, we'd have to come and revisit that.
Okay, thank you.
A couple of questions that I have. Obviously, we've talked a little bit about the dipping into the reserves to cover some of this deficit for the next fiscal year. That roughly $250,000 that we would take from reserves. Can you provide any context for, as far as I can tell from my experience on the board, that's much larger than we've done in recent years. Can you provide any context for going further back to give us some context of how big this withdrawal is from the reserves?
Yeah, it's true. In recent history, we've run deficits, but they haven't been as big as this. Although in 21-22, the projected deficit was about 220,000. As happens in many years, didn't turn out to be that much. It was still a deficit. Some years there's been projections of a deficit and there's been a surplus, as you know. Going back further, we've run deficits that have been significantly higher than this. I think in the early 2000s, there was one year where the projection was about $800,000. It didn't wind up being that much. And then there have been years where I think the projections were, 500, 300, 200, that kind of thing. And sometimes they've even run surpluses despite the projection. So we do the best that we can with the information we have at a moment in time, but it's not unprecedented.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I'll point out also that even with that $250,000 coming out of the reserve, that our projected reserve at the end of the fiscal year would still be beyond what the city recommends to hold in the reserves. I think the numbers are that they would recommend for us 1.57 or 1.58 million, and our projected reserve at the end of the fiscal year is 1.52. I'm sorry, I said that reverse. They recommend 1.52 million. Ours would be 1.58 million. So still over that recommendation.
Right. Exactly.
Okay. And then, as you mentioned, we're projecting potential surpluses, or we may have projected surpluses in future fiscal years that could help to raise that reserve even higher. One other question I have is that in the overtime section of the memo, it was mentioned that that's largely used to pay for community outreach events and project work. Can you provide a couple of examples to help the public understand what staff is doing in that overtime?
Sure. So like I mentioned in my comments tonight, we held seminars often in the evening. We have staff that attends those. The Pride event's going to be on the weekend, so that's going to be overtime. There's other events, there's city events like National Night Out, which we table at or attend. So those are the community outreach things we do. And the project-related needs are, like right now, as many of you know, and I mentioned in my comments, we've got a lot of mailings going out. It's not just mailing, believe me. It's a big project, and sometimes people have to stay late to get that done. there's sometimes litigation, although, right now it's not too bad, but if litigation has deadlines and if we need support staff to stick around to help with that kind of thing, that can drive overtime. There's the board meetings, these are after hours. And then just staff coverage, sometimes we'll have people on leave, sick, whatever, so we have to fill that in. That's where that comes from.
Okay. And my final question is about the what seems to be the main driver of the deficit, which is the capital outlay, the building renovation. We are allocating $300,000, and I was just curious what, obviously, I think it's very common that construction projects can go over budget, and just wondering what if you're accounting for that building and perhaps more than we think the project may cost.
We are, based on our discussions with the staff in the city that sort of oversees these projects, we built in a $50,000 buffer because, as you pointed out, as anyone knows who's renovated anything, it's never what you think it's going to be.
In particular in old buildings.
Yeah. So we do have that buffer there.
Okay, good to hear. Great, okay, and I think there's no one else in the queue. Do we have any other questions? Okay. Let's see. And we don't have any public speakers. So any commissioner wish to begin discussion or to make a motion?
I'll make a motion.
Commissioner Ambrose?
I'll make the motion. I move to adopt the proposed annual operating budget for the fiscal year 2025, 2026.
Do we have a second?
I second the motion.
All right, motion by Commissioner Ambrose and seconded by Commissioner Leslie. May we have a roll call, please?
Yes. Commissioner Ambrose,
Yes.
Commissioner Leslie,
Yes.
Vice Chair Ivanov,
Yes.
and Chair Gonska.
Yes.
Motion carries.
All right, moving along to item 11C. Our final public hearing tonight concerns an amendment to Regulation 11200B regarding the annual registration fee. May we have a staff report, please?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Tonight, the board will hold a public hearing to consider a proposed amendment to Regulation 11200 sub B, which governs the annual registration fee paid by owners of rent-controlled units. Staff is recommending an increase in the annual per-unit fee from $228 to $240, an increase of $12 per unit, or just $1 per month. This adjustment is intended to address one-time expenses and help maintain fiscal balance in upcoming budget cycles. Without this increase, the projected deficit would grow to nearly $580,000, significantly depleting the board's reserves. The proposed fee remains well below the charter cap of $288 and is necessary to maintain the agency's fiscal stability and meet its reasonable and necessary operating expenses. Staff recommends adopting the proposed amendment following the public hearing.
Do any commissioners have questions about the staff report? Okay. The public hearing is now open. Are there any speakers on this item? Don't believe so. Okay, then we will close the public hearing. Any commissioners wish to begin discussion on the item? Okay, only comment I have here is that I think, as we just discussed during the budget discussion and in the previous meeting, I think the staff and the agency is doing an excellent job of being fiscally responsible. Both, the data shows that just with where our reserves are at and with how closely how often we do come in under budget. So I think that I'm confident, and I think the public can be confident that we have good fiscal stewards here over this budget, and we don't raise the rent. We don't raise the registration fee unless absolutely necessary, and we don't do it frequently. We do it every several years, usually. This is a very modest increase. We actually have the authority to raise the registration fee beyond what's proposed here. And here it is $12 per year, which is also split 50-50 between the landlords and the tenants. So what we're discussing here is really 50 cents per month for the tenant, which I think, as was mentioned earlier, the amount of value that tenants get from having the rent control agency, the staff, the entire program that we do have here, in my opinion, far exceeds the the cost here. I think it's a really good deal. I'm always very conscious with rents being so high, with inflation being so high, that we're not unnecessarily raising costs on tenants. But as I mentioned, I think this 50 cents per month is very manageable for folks. So I'll be supporting it, but would love to hear from any other commissioners. Commissioner Leslie?
I kind of second what you're saying, backing you up. This was very well thought out and very well discussed in our meetings as far as just how much fiscally this could affect our tenants and our landlords. Actually, they says 12, but splitting it in half is only $6. The cost of a cup of coffee, basically, for small cup of Starbucks. So to be able to protect tenants and landlords is well worth it. Thank you for your fiscal responsibility.
Commissioner Ambrose?
Yeah, and I just wanted to note that this is the only way, right, that our agency is funded is through registration fees. Am I correct? Yes. So, without having these registration fees, we could not exist. And of course, with inflation, we must raise the registration fees every so often. So this is needed. And I don't see anyone else in the queue, so I think I will go ahead and make the motion to amend Regulation 11-200B to increase the annual registration fee from $228 to $240 per unit, effective of the fiscal year 2025-2026.
Second.
Okay, we have a motion from Commissioner Ambrose and second from Vice Chair Ivanov. Can we have a roll call vote, please?
Yes. Commissioner Ambrose,
Yes.
Commissioner Leslie,
Yes.
Vice Chair Ivanov,
Yes.
and Chair Gonska.
Yes.
The motion carries.
Okay, next up on the agenda, we have administrative items. So item 12A is an addendum to the employment agreement with our executive director. May we have a staff report, please?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Tonight, the board is being asked to approve an addendum to my employment agreement as executive director. The addendum provides for a series of modest cost of living adjustments over the remainder of the contract period, with the following bottom line salary figures to comply with disclosure requirements. From January 1st to January 30th, 2025, a 1% COLA would set my monthly salary at $19,832. Effective July 1st, 2025, a 2% COLA would increase it to $20,229. On July 1st, 2026, a further 2% COLA would bring it to $20,634. And on July 1st, 2027, a final 2% COLA would raise it to $21,047. This means my annual salary would range from $237,984 to $252,564 over the course of the contract. The addendum also includes a time-limited tuition benefit of up to $15,000 per year in fiscal year 25-26 and fiscal year 26-27 to support my enrollment in the MPA program at CSUN for a total maximum of $30,000. This benefit is not part of my base salary or pensionable earnings. 2 additional floating holidays consistent with those provided to other bargaining units and other contracted employees. Flexibility in taking bereavement leave, allowing non-consecutive days within a 3-month window, also consistent with the bargaining units and other contracted employees, and a commitment to annual performance reviews beginning in May 2026. I respectfully request the board's approval of the addendum as presented, and I'm available for any questions.
Okay, thank you very much. Any questions about the staff report before we move to public comment? Okay, I don't believe we have any, I don't have any speaker slips, but are there any members of the public that wish to address the board on this item? Okay. My comment is really just that I think that, the cost of living adjustments, in my opinion, are very modest each year as part of this plan. Frankly, they're in the next year, they're below inflation. for the foreseeable future, if where inflation is and has been, it's likely that these increases could be below inflation every year. So I don't have any issues with these, and I appreciate the amount of work that went into proposing this. And I also just want to comment that the tuition benefit for enrollment in the Master of Public Administration program, I think is great. That's something that, obviously you're going to learn a lot from, and it's something that directly will benefit the residents of this community to have an already very capable executive director be even more capable. So thank you for bringing this to this, and I'm supportive of it. Do we have any other questions or comments? You're good, Kay? Awesome. Okay. Then is any commissioner prepared to make a motion? I'll move that we approve the negotiated addendum to the employment agreement with Executive Director Jonathan Holub. Do we have a second?
I'll second the motion.
Okay. Can we have a roll call vote, please?
Yes. Commissioner Ambrose,
Yes.
Commissioner Leslie,
Yes.
Vice Chair Ivanov,
Yes.
Chair Gonska.
Yes.
Motion carries.
Okay, and the final agenda item tonight is item 12B. Consideration of a resolution supporting Senate Bill 52. May we have a staff report, please?
Yes, thank you, Chair. This is a Senate bill that was introduced by State Senator Perez that would regulate the use of the algorithmic rental software pricing that you heard about this evening from Chief Deputy City Attorney Ganschow. This would be prohibiting, it's basically the same, similar language as to what the city has introduced and what has been introduced in other cities in the state. It would prohibit the sale, use, and licensing of this software with non-public data to set rent levels and occupancy levels in rental units throughout the state. What you have before you are two resolutions on this topic, one of which contains an amendment. What I noticed about this legislation is it doesn't have any preemption, any language about preemption. And so one concern that I had is without that language, it could be interpreted as preempting any local efforts on this topic. And so we could suggest to the author that they consider amending the legislation to include this type of language so that cities like ours can also act in this area and that we would not be preempted from acting in this area. So if the board wishes to consider that language, that's before you as well. Thank you.
Thank you for that report. I don't believe we have any members of the public that would wish to address the board. Any questions or comments from commissioners? Oh, Commissioner Ambrose.
Okay, so I do have a question. For the extra language, the nothing in this section shall be construed to affect the authority of a public entity to legislate in this area or enact regulations governing the use, sale, or licensing of algorithmic rental pricing software. So would that mean that a city would be allowed to have price fixing software if they wanted to?
So this only means that a city would not be prohibited from enacting regulations around this. So if a city chooses, but I see what you're saying. If a city chooses not to regulate in this area, the state law would govern. So they would still be governed by the state law, even if there's a city that doesn't want to implement prohibitions, but they wouldn't be able to. I see what you're saying.
Like supersede it by having a law that says we allow it.
Right.
That's my concern with that extra language.
Yeah, that's a good point. So I could include, the language could say specifically, nothing prohibits cities from prohibiting it. How about that? Because you want it to be specific to prohibition, but you want the state law to preempt any efforts to allow it.
Right.
Is that what you're saying? Yeah. So we could make that more specific, since that's our intent.
Commissioner Leslie?
I think she kind of answered my question, but I'm gonna ask it anyway, just to make sure. I'm gonna double down a little bit. So if we added the preemptive language to this, how would that affect?
So if we added this language, then that would allow Santa Monica to do what it's doing. It would allow the council to pass its own ordinance prohibiting the software.
Okay, just making sure.
That's the goal.
So if the city council passes if the city council were to pass the ban on the software usage, and then the state passes this law or a version of this law that wasn't as strict or thorough as our rules, then ours, we would have, without this language, ours would not be enforceable. Is that correct? That the state law would apply?
I think there's enough of a question around that's why we're suggesting that there be specific language so that it would eliminate any doubt around that. Because a court, without any kind of language, a court could potentially interpret what the state is doing as kind of preempting the field and preempting any other city from legislating in this area.
Okay, and do we know if there is discussion in Senate committees or otherwise about that, or is this something that we're sort of flagging originally?
I have flagged it for our lobbyist, Brian Augusta, and he's talking to the author. And I've presented some similar language to him. So if whatever's passed here, I'll provide to him.
Great.
And then he'll take that to the author.
Okay. Vice Chair Ivanov?
This is being like super nitpicky, but instead of just saying public entity, just to be like super clear, do we want to say like city, county, municipality, public entity, or agency? Because when I think, I know obviously like a city is a public entity, but sometimes when I think of a public entity, I just think of like a narrow definition of like a city agency. So just to be like completely expansive and make sure we have everything covered. I don't know if it makes sense to include that or not, or
I
if
think
we
we
agree
could
with that.
say public entity, including cities, counties,
Right,
other municipalities.
right.
Commissioner Ambrose?
So are we changing the language now?
Yes.
Okay, because, yeah, I'm just concerned with like the unintended consequences, so is this just for our city, or this would apply for other places as well?
This would be a suggestion for the state law.
For this,
to
okay,
put
so
in the
like,
state
because
law.
I'm concerned about like other areas that might either be ignorant to the law, or maybe there's lobbying going on that might, for whatever reason, like RealPage or algorithmic software for whatever reason. Is there a way that we could see like what the language is, like after we?
Sure. So what I'm proposing is we can say, nothing in this section shall be construed to affect the authority of a public entity, including cities, counties, other municipalities, from enacting regulations prohibiting. So I would take out legislate in this area, and I would say from enacting regulations instead of governing, prohibiting.
Okay.
And I think that would address your concern,
Of being able to
Commissioner
supersede.
Ambrose, right,
Okay.
of being able to encourage the use as opposed to prohibiting the use.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Okay.
And just to be clear, if we're adopting this language, local jurisdictions, if they choose to regulate this, can go further than what the state, give greater protections or strengthen their protections more so than what the state is doing. But they could not, under any circumstance, have less protection than what the state is doing, because then they would be in violation of the state statute.
Yes. And in fact, what we could also do, so the Tenant Protection Act has that exact language, like nothing in this prevents a city from enacting greater protections for tenants. So we could do something like that. We could add a clause like that, If, you know, instead of prohibiting, if you wanted to say, from enacting regulations that provide greater protections to tenants in the area of this rental pricing software.
Well, we wouldn't be against another jurisdiction going further than the state.
Correct.
Right.
We would say nothing in this state law prevents a city from going further.
Okay.
Essentially.
Because that language is not currently in the bill, is,
Right.
Correct,
There's
okay.
nothing about that currently in the bill.
I think I like that better than the way it's currently drafted.
Okay.
I don't know if anyone agrees with me or not.
I would agree with that, yeah.
Because if we're modeling after the TPA, I think that
Okay.
probably works better.
So I think it's clear what you all want, but why don't I do this? If you want to approve the resolution with the amendment tonight, what I can do is draft specific language with your direction. I can send it to you, and if it's consistent, then I won't need to bring it back. But assuming that it's consistent with what you want, we can go forward. If it's inconsistent, then we can bring it back before I send it over to Brian.
That sounds okay to me. And I think when we make a motion tonight, I think we'll need some help in terms, because we've made some changes here, so it's not,
Yes.
you know, just in terms of, maybe you can do a reading or summary of it, of what the motion should be. But before we get to that, I think there's also the question here of, because what we're doing here is voting to whether or not to support this Senate bill. So there's a question in my mind of what happens if the Senate doesn't amend their legislation with our recommendation? Do we still support it as it currently exists? And so I think we should discuss and decide if we want to vote to support the existing legislation and also make a recommendation, or to only support it on the basis that it's amended how we've been discussing tonight. Does that make sense? Commissioner Leslie?
So in tapping into the vein of what you've just said, it makes sense because of the additions that we've made or the addendums that we made to this Senate bill, is so that there's not as much wiggle room. Because when you go into contract law and different types of law, so much as a comma changes the whole entire thing. The suggestions that Commissioner Ivanov, or Vice Chair Ivanov suggested, makes it more concrete and more fluid as far as exactly what the intention is. So I would be voting for something only if the addendums or the additions were added.
Okay. Commissioner Ambrose?
I would support it with or without. I think it takes a lot to get language and to move things forward in the Senate. It's a 3-sentence language that we would like to get in there. Of course, we want it in there, but I would be fine supporting it either way. I know we have option 1 and option 2, and that's what we're voting on right now. For me personally, if I want the option that includes the language, but if, I'm not sure what the question is.
Well, there could also be we can create other options. It doesn't have to be one or two that's listed here in the report. So an option 3 could be that we're voting to support the resolution, the Senate Bill 52 as it exists. We're also recommending that the Senate amend it with what we've discussed tonight.
Right.
But I mean, I guess the question is, I guess it's more of a political question of like, what is more likely to put pressure or encourage, more likely to have our intended outcome if we, if they're only going to be able to say that they have Santa Monica Rent Control's board support, if it includes these amendments, we could do that. But if they don't make those amendments, then we wouldn't be on record supporting it. I think that's the question that I'm raising. And it sounds like we potentially have difference of opinion, but this isn't super incompatible, but I think it's a nuance that's important nonetheless.
Well, what's the question that we're being asked tonight on this item?
Well, those, it's basically if we want to, if we want to make, if we want to vote to support SB 52 is the basic, but there's the nuance to that is, do we want to support it as it exists? Do we want to support it as it, with the discussed amendments? Or a hybrid of those where we're voting to support it as it exists, but also recommending that we want them to make those changes, but our support isn't contingent on those amendments being made.
Okay, understood, that it's not contingent, but we would just recommend additional language.
Yeah. I mean, you know, I realize I'm the one that raised this, but I think the more I think about it, I think it is potentially more likely that it gives it more weight to consider the amendment, it gives our vote more weight for the Senate to consider their amendments if our support is contingent on those amendments being made. The one question I do have, though, is I guess, obviously what's being pointed out here is that without these provisions, potentially what Santa Monica is doing on the local level could be made moot, superseded by the Senate bill. But I guess I'm looking for some sort of context in terms of how much of a risk that is, you know, because I think, in my opinion, I think I would like to see this banned statewide. So I would support, even if we don't necessarily get the amendments we want, I think that it's a strong enough bill that I would still support it at the Senate level. But with my previous question of, you know, is it likely to result in actually a problem or a loophole that we don't intend if they don't make these amendments?
Because it's hard to say. I mean, generally, you know, courts are reluctant to find preemption without a clear intent by the legislature. So it's probably, especially when the action at the local level is consistent with what the state is doing. If there were a clear conflict, then I think that would be a pretty easy question. But when you have all these cities acting in concert with what the state is doing, it's probably not that big of a risk. You know, it's always good to be clear to help the courts out, but, you know, if this language is not in the bill, I think, I don't think the risk is too high of preemption.
Got it, okay. Commissioner Ivanov, or Vice Chair Ivanov?
Yeah, I agree with Commissioner Ambrose that I would support either version of this bill. There's no affirmative language, you know, in SB 52 as originally drafted that, you know, prevents local jurisdictions from taking any action on this issue. This is really like the whole purpose of this amendment is really us just doing our due diligence to make sure that there's not any unintended consequences. I don't really see a likelihood of that being something that would happen. I think this is just us being very thorough. So I would be, you know, in support of both of these resolutions.
Okay, yeah, I agree with that. So my recommendation, or the motion I would like to make, again, we're gonna need some help because of the changes we made in terms of what exactly we should move tonight, but I think what I'm intending to move is supporting the enactment of SB 52 with suggestions for specific amendments.
Yeah, so what you could do is move to support Resolution 25-002 and suggest the following amendment to the author. And I've been able to draft some language while you were discussing. So nothing in this section shall be construed to affect the authority of a public entity, including cities and counties, to enact regulations, comma, which provide greater tenant protections, comma, governing the use, sale, or licensing of algorithmic rental pricing software. Does
Okay.
that,
Yeah,
does that do it? Okay.
That sounds perfect to me.
Okay.
Okay. So is that sufficient to move that?
Yes.
Okay, so, thank you.
You
And
don't have
then
to
do we have a
repeat.
second on that?
Second.
Okay, may we have a roll call vote, please?
Yes. Commissioner Ambrose,
Yes.
Commissioner Leslie,
Yes.
Vice Chair Ivanov,
Yes.
Chair Gonska.
Yes.
Motion carries.
Okay, that concludes the full agenda for tonight. Can I have a motion to adjourn the meeting to the next regular meeting of the Santa Monica Rent Control Board, which will take place on July 10th, 2025?
I make a motion to adjourn.
And do we have a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
The meeting is adjourned.